Okay, chapter 7 section 3 then starts off by talking about measuring performance. So in the first recording for chapter 7 we discussed what the finance function does. We came up with a few examples for each of those key areas, and then we considered how we manage the function, and we basically decided that the things that impact how we manage the finance function are basically the same as things that impact how we manage any function. So section 3 moves on and starts thinking about how we measure performance, and obviously that's a key part of the finance function. So we briefly here discuss qualitative measures. Now, qualitative measures are subjective, so they're not numerical. So we can't really put a number on them. So for example, obviously not an example relating to finance, but something like how soft is the cat's fur. So something that you can't put a number on. The cat might be very soft or extremely soft or kind of soft or not really that soft at all, but either way, not something you can put a number on. We don't really kind of worry about that too much right now. What we want to focus on are these quantitative measures, and this is where you actually have a number. So these are going to be things that you're much more used to seeing at work, and we're actually going to look at quantitative measures, so these kind of number based measures, which can be financial and non-financial. So not necessarily looking at purely financial. It can still be things like the kind of average customer satisfaction score, something like that. So for example, if you come here to First Intuition and you sit a classroom course, we'll give you a feedback form at the end of the course that basically gets you to grade us on a number of different things out of 5. So 5 being very good and 1 obviously being not so good. And that will give us an idea here at First Intuition of customer satisfaction, which is a non-financial measure, but it's still a quantitative measure because it's a number. So we can still look at the average over the year, for example. Now, the measures that we're going to look at in Chapter 7 here are how we measure profitability, how we measure activity, and how we measure productivity. So these are the 3 key areas, 3 points of reference for a measure in almost every business. So that's what we're going to focus on. So we start off here just by having a bit of an overview of each one, and then we look at them in a bit more detail. So when we're talking about profitability, well, I know that all of my revenue less my costs will give me profit. So I can measure profitability by looking at these 2 things, revenue and costs. When I come to look at activity then, this is where we might bring in some of those non-financials. So for example, number of orders received from a customer. So I might see that a particular customer has increased their orders by 10%. So they're ordering 10% more often than they did in the previous period, for example. Or number of machine breakdowns. So I might be able to measure how well my repair and maintenance department are doing by saying, look, machine breakdowns are down by 7% on last year. That's really good work. That's meant that we can work a lot longer. Really good. And then productivity is going to be considering what we're getting out of the business compared to what we put in. So for example, how many items are I getting processed per 1 hour of employee time that I put in, or per employee that I put into the process. So it's a relative measure of what we're getting out to what we've put in. And like I said, we're going to have a look in a bit more detail at those things now. So we'll consider a bit more how we can actually measure those things rather than just what they contain. Okay, so let's think about how we can measure these. So like we said, measuring profitability can be looking at costs versus revenues, and we can measure that in both absolute terms. So this was the budgeted profit in pounds or dollars for the period, and this was the actual profit in pounds or dollars for the period, or in relative terms. So we can look at things like gross profit percentage or operating profit percentage, something like that. Okay, 3.2.2 then starts to look at this idea of resource use. So it's all very well saying we've got this amount of dollars in profit, but a better measurement perhaps would be to compare that with what we've actually had to put into the business. So underneath here we've got a few examples of the the type of resource that we're going to have to consider. So obviously you have things like material and labor and finance, but also things like our physical assets. So how much have I had to invest in buildings and machinery in order to drive this profit through? What about my competences? What am I good at doing? So there's a key resource for me to have. Intangible assets, so my brand, think about Coca-Cola, the value of that brand would be immense. The recognition of the brand and the association with a particular type of product. Thinking about how my business is structured, thinking about the knowledge that we have available. So all these things we're going to need to consider in terms of what I've had to use, what resources I've had to use in order to achieve whatever I've achieved in the period. So really important that we consider that. Now, when we're talking about use of resources, we come back to this idea of the 3 E's. So the 3 E's, economy, efficiency and effectiveness, are just a way of really trying to calculate or trying to think about almost value for money, and that's often what we associate with the 3 E's, so this idea of value for money. And if I can take you back for a second just to think about this idea of a system that we saw, where we said anything that's got some sort of input that then takes that input and puts it through some sort of process that gives them an output, we said was a system. Well, the 3 E's is a really nice way to think about how we measure this kind of use of resources. So economy, which is trying to keep my costs down, is saying, well, for example, how cheaply am I obtaining my inputs? How cheaply am I obtaining all of these resources that I need to use? Efficiency says, well, let's make sure that the process of turning my ins into outs is good. So yes, I want to be cheap, but at the same time, I don't want to lose that operational effectiveness. And then effectiveness is saying, well, have I achieved what I set out to do overall? And thinking about that in terms of this output from my system is a really nice idea. So it's a nice way to think about what we mean by those 3 E's. Okay, over the page then. 3.2.3 and 3.2.4 then are considering that every business will have something that's very important to them, or several things that are really important for them that they must excel at to kind of achieve their overall objectives, and CSFs then in KPIs really try to build on that. Now, like I said, every business will be slightly different. So whilst some businesses are going to have to focus on price, so some markets are very, very price sensitive, so we'll think a bit more about that when we get towards the end of the course, when we look at the kind of economics section. Others then really have to focus on quality. So I know that if I've got a very competitive market that's very high quality, then I might need to focus on quality and price. So lots of companies will have to do that. And what a CSF does is say, well, let's consider what's really, really important for me. And that's how I'm going to have to kind of measure my performance. If I can see how well I'm doing at the things that are really important for me to do well, then that's going to give me a good indication of how well I'm doing overall. A KPI then is where we take that CSF, that critical success factor, the thing that's crucial if I'm going to succeed as a business, I try and turn that into a measurement, so normally something a bit more numerical. Over on the right hand side in the green boxes there, we've got a good example of the whole process. So let's say that in my business, one of the key success factors is make sure I deliver to people on time, and in this case we've got this kind of 24-hour period. So that's my critical success factor, so I must do that. We've got a core competence there, and this is what's going to allow me to achieve that CSF. In this case, well, let's just say that our IT systems have to be really good in order for me to take that order from the customer, to process that, and to get it through to my distribution department to make sure it goes out on time. The KPI then, which is what we're going to measure and how we're going to measure how well we're doing, is to say, well, let's make sure that IT system has a downtime of, say, at the maximum 2% per month. And one way of coming up with, for example, the 2% per month would be to say, well, let's see what everybody else is doing. Let's use benchmarking to see whether somebody else in my industry is doing something better, somebody else internally within my business is doing better, or maybe just somebody who's really good at doing that, regardless of what market or what product they sell. Finally, with 3.2.5 then, we start thinking about sustainability. So although it seems like sustainability is kind of tagged on the end here after we've got past all the important numbers, really sustainability is a key measure, and it's becoming more and more important for businesses as we move forward. So certainly far more important than it would have been to businesses, say, 30 or 40 years ago. Now, we've broken down this kind of measuring of sustainability management into three areas: into social, into environmental, and into economic. And we've got a nice table here that just gives me some examples of what I could measure to see how sustainable my business is. So in terms of social sustainability, how do I treat my workers? How fair are my pay and benefit packages? Am I treating them well? Are they feeling well rewarded? Environmental then will be fairly well known. So thinking about what pollution I'm kind of releasing into the atmosphere, thinking about my wastage. So consider the 3 E's for a second. That efficiency area where we look at the process, that's going to have a big focus on wastage. So I don't want to buy lots of raw materials and then waste some of it and have a lesser output. And then finally economic stability. So thinking about, am I still keeping the job market going? Am I employing local people? Am I helping to develop the local environment? So these things are really important to a business. So it's not all about just focusing on profits. Now, as with everything we've seen, there's going to be certain limitations of my financial measures, and these are really going to be down to the numbers that I use. Either, the numbers, so the base information, so the actual, historic cost data and things like that, so the recording of my transactions, or with whatever I'm comparing my numbers with. So a number on its own is often very useless, and it's only when we compare it with something like a competitor or like a budget or like a forecast that we actually get an idea of whether it's showing me anything or not. So these three limitations just go through those ideas. So firstly, perhaps the actual information that I'm using is a bit out of date, which could be likely. So if you think about you using standard costs or something like that when costing a product, could absolutely be out of date. Think about different trends when we're talking about comparison. So the fact that over time prices change, so I can no longer perhaps start thinking about looking at a year-on-year performance. And then finally, if I'm starting to compare myself with industry averages, for example, there's not an average company. So some companies will be large and equity finance, some companies will be small and debt finance, and trying to compare myself with an average of those two things is very difficult. So financial measures are obviously very important, but as with everything have certain limitations. Okay, now leading on from those limitations, the balanced scorecard, which was put together by Kaplan and Norton, set out to say, bearing in mind I have these limitations of financial measures, bearing in mind that financial measurements tend to give me a measurement of how well I've done in the past, surely it would be better to think about different measures that might help me figure out how well I'm going to do in the future. And that's what they set out to do when they looked at the balanced scorecard. So the balanced scorecard is an integrated set of performance measures linked to the achievement of strategic objectives. So that's really important, thinking about the fact that I'm still bearing in mind whatever those objectives are. And the key thing here is that they're not just going to look at financial measures. They're not just going to say, yes, I've achieved my gross profit margin target for the period. Just because I've achieved that this period doesn't mean that I'm going to do well next period. Surely there's some other measures that I could use that are going to be more useful for that. So that's what Kaplan and Norton set out to do. So here are the four measures then. So first of all, let me just deal with the fact that yes, they still consider financial measurements to be important, and it's absolutely key. Knowing how well we've done, to looking at return on capital employed, for example, looking at my gearing, so how much debt I have compared to my equity investment, really, really important. But lots and lots of measurements deal with those financials. It's Kaplan and Norton's balanced scorecard then that started to consider these other measurements. So what questions were they trying to answer? First of all, then they were trying to think about what the customer thinks about us. And now, thinking about what I said in terms of non-financial measures, which this is one of, may give us a better indication of the future. Well, this is a key one. If I know that my customers think we're really good and they really enjoy buying from us, and they know that we're reliable, then we offer good value for money, then it doesn't necessarily matter how well I've done this year. It looks good for the future. So for example, I might be able to look at satisfaction ratings. Or if it's not that type of product, I might be able to say, well, how many products have I had returned? The second question then is, what am I doing about the future? How can I carry on doing well? Am I standing still or am I progressing? If I know that I'm learning and I'm introducing new exciting products to the market, for example, then perhaps I can give myself a better indication of how well I'm going to do. So what questions could I ask myself here? How long does it take me to get a new product to the market? Also included in that learning aspect is kind of my employee happiness, so employee retention rates. If I'm training and improving and developing my staff, they're likely to stay for longer. The third really important question then was, how good am I at doing what's really important to me? So this idea of internal business processes is going to be very different for every business. And it's just saying, what must I be really good at in order to achieve what I want to achieve? So for example, here at First Intuition, what must we be really good at? Well, obviously, getting students through exams, developing good material, but also things like a good smooth customer booking process. So when a student calls up to book a course or an exam, we have to make sure we're really good at that. So that might be something that we measure. So amount of time taken to reply to a student query or something like that. So it's going to be different for every business. Okay, so balanced scorecard, really important. 4 key questions, and the non-financials tend to give me a better indication of what I'm going to do in the future. Okay, finally then for chapter 7, just a quick look at financial controls, focusing on what an internal control really is. So obviously it's really important for us to have internal controls to make sure that we're protecting what we have. And really we're trying to give assurance, and in particular reasonable assurance, around, say, these 3 things. So the effectiveness and efficiency of operations, reliability of financial reporting, and compliance with laws and regulations. If my internal control system enables those things to occur, then I'm doing pretty well. Now, in terms of what a business does for internal controls, we're not just thinking about you have to have this certain expense signed off before you can incur it. Yes, that is an example of part of an internal control, but there's much more around the internal control system than just that. And underneath here we've got those 5 key elements of an internal control system. So first of all, we've got the control environment. Now the control environment for a business is just going to be kind of the attitudes of those in charge. Okay, it's the overall tone of the business. Okay, so if the people at the top think that controls are important, then that tends to filter down through the whole business, and the whole business then will deem controls to be a key part. Second, we've got risk management. So how good are we at identifying and managing the risk that we face? And we had a look at this in a previous chapter. Control activities are where we're going to see the example of an actual control. So for example, I know that certain things will require approval, so I'll have to approve some sort of expenditure, and things like segregation of duties. So not allowing one person to create a new supplier, to pay a new supplier, to change supplier details, and that sort of thing. Information and communication is just saying, well, if I'm able to have effective communication, and this will include things like my information systems. If I have effective communication, that's going to help me to kind of achieve my objectives here. And then finally, monitoring activities. So it's all very well saying this is what I do, but somebody has to check it. So are we doing what we should do? So that's where monitoring activities comes in. The final part of the chapter then just looks at the FRC's take on this, and we've got a list here of things that a company or an internal control system should do. So it should assess current and emerging risks, and obviously respond appropriately. So this idea of safeguarding assets kind of falls into my stewardship approach. Help to reduce the likelihood and the impact of my poor decision making. Help to ensure the quality of internal and external reporting, and help to ensure compliance with any laws and regulations. So quite similar to those COSO internal control elements. Okay, that's the end of chapter 7 then, and next up we'll have a look at chapter 8, which is starting to look at business and personal finance.